In Orwell's book, 1984, they had what was called doublespeak. Expressions such as war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. This was related to doublethink. Doublethink is defined as the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts in one's head. They are the result of indoctrination. They are only present because an overwhelming force convinced the thinker that both are true. Now, as we will see in this video, during the recent um, event, we'll call it, because algorithms, we have to be careful of censorship, but we're going to see how the Watchtower organization, in particular the governing body, could be likened to the party. In Orwell's book, The Party with a capital P, they represented Big Brother, who we might compare or illustrate that Big Brother could well picture Jehovah, or Jehovah Big Brother, with the governing body or the organization with a capital O representing the party. And we're going to see in this video how double speak, they didn't say these words, but the double think that they presented could be worded in double speak as choice is unity or choice is conformity, because we'll see how both the Bible and organizational direction has always been that medical choice is just that, a personal choice or decision, which no Christian would push upon another. So we'll see how they never changed this understanding, but then violated it directly, while at the same time the members believed that the governing body was presenting choice, at the same time that they were taking away choice, and both thoughts were held at the same time. Quoting Orwell, he said, "To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment it was needed, and then promptly forget it again." Now, in the world today, and among Jehovah's Witnesses, the narrative, so to speak, no matter how often the narrative changes, or how it even contradicts itself, often in real time, it's always the undisputed truth. What always matters is the narrative. And this is why, like the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses has used the term present truth, as if truth changes. But what it really means is that the party is always right, or the organization, the governing body, is always right in the present tense. And so in Orwell's book 1984, Winston Smith, he worked in the Ministry of Truth, and it was his job. He actually had to update historical documents that were in the records, such as newspapers and magazines and that. And then after he updated them, he would memory hole. He actually had a chute, I believe. He would put the old file, the old record of the newspapers down the memory hole, no doubt to an incinerator where they were burned up. And so history was always being revised. Really, history was being revised even as it was being written. To quote Orwell again, he said, "History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right." And so we could say the same thing for the Watchtower organization as represented by its governing body. Quoting Orwell again, but substituting, we could say, "History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the organization or the governing body is always right." Beginning in 2020, the governing body started doing governing body updates. I think even the first one, they might have even called it pandemic update. And then they started calling them governing body updates. The little clip I'm going to show you here is from the December 2020 update, and this was the very month that the governments were first releasing the treatment, the procedure, as we'll call it. Again, watching concern for the algorithms. But here's just a little clip, and you'll see in it, this was the continuation of an ongoing inaccuracy, but also really a motive of stoking fear, trying to motivate concern for safety, but ostensibly safety, but doing so by stoking fear. So just notice this little clip.
Rather than being overconfident when it comes to our safety and thinking it can't happen to me, we have good reason to beware and remain cautious. Sadly, as of December 20th, more than 7,500 of our brothers and sisters worldwide have died from COVID-19.
Now this was the pattern. They continued to do this as the death toll mounted. I remember then later it got up to 20,000, and they would say 20,000 of our dear brothers and sisters have died. And they would say they would say from, which is very disingenuous, from the virus, directly saying from it. But see, this was impossible to know because, I mean, you would need an autopsy, and anybody that's followed this knew that basically they were putting down all types of death as caused by the virus, even though they weren't. And this is interesting because the organization has always prided itself on being very precise and never exaggerating things. So this caught my attention immediately when they said from. I said, well, that's an intentional exaggeration because there's no way they could know that. It's sort of like in a criminal, like in a news story, they'll report on a crime and they'll say alleged because it hasn't been tried in court yet. So the alleged perpetrator is just an alleged crime until the evidence is weighed in court. And so normally people will use that expression that it's alleged. And so really, in this case, these deaths from really had to be qualified in some way, which they didn't do. And this was the pattern. They continued this throughout the event. And the thing about it too is, as we'll see, they were really laying the groundwork, just as the governments were, to stoke the fear for the one final solution, which was to come out. And so this particular broadcast was timed with the beginning of that. Now I have some references here. Now these are compiled. These are all from Watchtower organization publications, and this is to show, as I mentioned at the outset, that the long-standing organizational policy, which is also accurately based, in my view, on Bible principles. But this is to show that this is what they've always maintained, and they never came out and changed this stance either. They're still maintaining that this is the stance. But it was at the same time that the governing body repeatedly, update after update, governing body update after governing body update, they directly violated everything here. And so I'm just going to highlight some of these here real briefly. I've highlighted some things here in yellow. The 1952 Watchtower said, "For the sake of the record, let us say that we are not medical advisors. We leave it up to each individual to choose his own type of treatment." And further down, the society is formed for the purpose of preaching the gospel. And in this field of activity, we are happy to offer help and advice. We are not professionally trained doctors, and underlined, this is their underlining, and do not advise on health matters. Oh, I take that back. I think this was added underlining. But anyways, it says they do not advise on health matters. So let's advance all the way up to 2015. A study article in the Watchtower. A branch office or the local congregation elders do not have authority to make medical decisions for a Christian, even if he asks what to do. And they cite Galatians 6:5, which I'm a little bit further in the video. I'm going to explain that because they use this scripture again in an announcement in April of 2021. But there's a long-standing principle, Galatians 6:5, which we'll elaborate on in a few minutes. And then they said a reasonable Christian will not try to force others to do what he thinks is best. Now, this I just have to mention that again in what I mentioned in the outset in the Orwell quote. It mentioned about the memory, you being able to bring things up from memory and then dismiss them again, bring them back again, and hold two thoughts at the same time that are contradictory. And you'll see that the governing body directly violates this. A reasonable Christian will not try to force others to do what he thinks is best. And while maintaining that that is still their stand, they go ahead and they do that. So let's see, we'll drop down to the 2011 Watchtower. Do Jehovah's Witnesses accept medical treatment? Witnesses do not rush into making medical decisions, nor do they blindly follow popular opinion. Instead, they weigh their options and examine Bible principles before making a decision. This was completely violated during this whole thing, where these experimental injections come out with insufficient trials of any kind, Operation Warp Speed, and suddenly the organization is blindly following popular opinion as this is the wise thing to do. And so now witnesses were rushing into making medical decisions blindly, instead of prayerfully weighing their options and examining Bible principles and making their decision. So again, obvious doublethink here. It's really surreal, actually. 2006 Watchtower. Furthermore, medical decisions often involve Bible principles, a person's conscience, and his relationship with Jehovah. Therefore, it would be unloving to impose our views on a fellow believer or pressure him to ignore the dictates of his conscience. Again, they just completely violated this, at the same time maintaining that they weren't, but they openly were violating this. In fact, as we'll see, when they talk about deciding whether to get the treatment or not, they didn't bring in Jehovah, your personal relationship, your own personal conscience as having any matter. In fact, as we'll see, they actually say that the government mandates override your Christian conscience, basically. 2003 Watchtower. Hence, when contemplating medical treatment, we are wise to seek reliable information rather than putting faith in every word. Safe and effective. How often was that said? Without any evidence yet, no long-term trials or anything to say it's safe and effective. Would that not be putting faith in every word? Then it says, with soundness of mind such soundness of mind can help us to weigh our options carefully and make an informed decision. Do you know that not one time to this date, from the beginning of this thing and in every single update, they never, ever, ever said informed consent, exercise informed consent. They never said something so simple as weigh risk versus benefit of this medical treatment and make an informed decision. The silence in that area was deafening, and this is because they wanted everybody to take it. So they didn't even dare mention weighing risk versus benefit. Rather, they just said, for all intents and purposes, they just said and implied, put faith in every word that you're hearing in the mainstream narrative. Put faith in every word. So again, they're violating their own principles just blatantly. Not to say such principles too, there's Bible principles like the whole world is lying in the power of the wicked one, or Satan is misleading the entire inhabited earth. And they've always maintained that Satan is misleading all the governments, misleading all the worldly institutions. So be very careful about putting faith or following men. But instead they turned around, and when the whole world in lockstep went into supporting this procedure as the salvation and cure for the new normal, they just went ahead and completely endorsed it, which is, and again, it's surreal because how do you get 8 million people, members of the organization, to just unlearn everything they ever knew about the world lying and being misled by Satan and lying in the power of the wicked one, and then at the same time have the doublethink to just say, oh, the world is out for our best interests. This is all for our safe and effective salvation, and is wonderful, and is from, basically implying it's from Jehovah God. 1994, the Watchtower Society does not make recommendations or decisions for individuals on medical and diagnostic practices. As we'll see, I've got the documentation. They do indeed go ahead and make recommendations, and even stronger than recommendations. I'll just mention it right here. I have the evidence, and maybe in a future video we'll delve into it in more depth. But I'm going to say it right here outright, and I have the evidence. They mandated for all special full-time servants in, it was August of 2021, they had a letter from the governing body, confidential letter to all special full-time servants. And these all special full-time servants would include all those serving at the various headquarters and branches, as they call Bethel, throughout the earth, and all the circuit overseers and their wives, as well as special pioneers and others in this form of special full-time service. They were all mandated. In other words, if they did not get the procedure, they had to leave their full-time service. This was what they did. And then in September of 2021, which I could cover in more depth later as well, they had an announcement given to all the elders and the circuit overseers, which basically was a purge of elders to silence any elders that were bold enough to speak up for their own conscience, as well as speaking up about the wrongness of Christians being forced to follow government mandates. They had to quickly put that fire out, with the circuit overseer overlooking the situation and making sure that any elders that persisted after the warning were purged out from being elders. Now, in December 2020, when the first two treatments or procedures were approved by the emergency use authorization, a lot of times people will say approved, but actually it was an authorization of emergency use. So that these procedures were actually still really a medical experiment. But anyways, just highlighting at this point, there was the first announcement that the organization that Jehovah's Witnesses had to the congregation, and they termed it I'll again substitute the word, I don't want to use the real word too often, but the procedure, it said procedure announcement, the V announcement. And basically they announced, and they actually gave the names of the two companies, the one you see here on the screen, and the other one that begins with an M, and they actually read off the company names of the treatments, and they said that they had got inquiries from members wondering about if there was blood fractions in these, which I don't know, it seemed almost like a premise to give them an excuse to have this announcement, because I don't know that too many were really wondering about that, at least as far as I knew. But anyways, it gave them an excuse to basically condone, in my view, to give a green light to these treatments, because they said they've looked into it and there's no blood fractions in it. And then they gave the little standard thing that medical treatment is a personal choice, a little brief announcement along those lines. But they know how people think, and indeed they did, because I know this firsthand. The friends said such things as, oh, these are the ones that they said, the governing body said we can have. In other words, these are the good ones. They were the only two that were were authorized by the government at this point in the United States, but basically the green light. And because they know, you have to understand it as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, if the governing body implies something is good, even in a kind of backhanded way such as this, that's the green light. Everybody knows that this is a good thing. Um, that's the way they would take it, that these are safe. So they hear on CNN, safe and effective, blah blah blah, and then they hear the governing body have an announcement, there's no blood fractions. It's like green light, go ahead. But at this time, I didn't really realize what was ahead. Maybe I was a little naive, but this was just laying the groundwork for what was to come. And so we'll talk about that next. There was an April 2021 announcement, and so let's go to look at that. So here's the April 2021 announcements. Before I go into that, I just had wanted to mention back about the December 2020 announcement. One of the other kind of stunning things about it, if you think about it, was the announcements are done during the meeting before the meeting closes with a song and prayer. So it was really kind of stunning to hear the names of these pharmaceutical corporations, their products mentioned between the prayers. The meetings are always highlighted. This is worship. It's a spiritual thing. But they actually put that announcement right in the spiritual program between the prayers. Just a side point there. So, anyways, if any aren't familiar, in recent years, the way they've done the announcements from the branch office is they do, instead of giving them out during the month, unless there's something exceptional, they'll have a monthly announcements that are read off to the congregation at the first meeting that the document is available, usually toward the beginning of the month. So the announcements and reminders will have a section that's just private for the elders, such as here there's revisions in the shepherding book, the elders handbook, and it goes into some updates there, various other things. Then you'll notice they have for some special instructions sometimes to the coordinator of the bodies of elders, for secretaries. But then you get into, there's always a section of announcements and reminders for the congregations. Now this is the part that's read out to the congregation. So in April they had things relating to various matters, but point number 3, again, these are all read out in numbered sequence at the meeting. So they had this section here, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These are all related to the P, the event here. As you see, if you have the visual, if you're just listening, it's the event. But if you have the visual, you can see the word here where my cursor is. So personal decisions during the P. In some parts of the world, governments have begun to make C19 treatments available to the public. Whether someone chooses to be V, procedured, treated, is a personal decision, Galatians 6:5. Thus it would be loving to respect the personal decision that each individual, italics, makes based on his Bible-trained conscience, instead of pressuring someone to make the same choice that we made. Now this is interesting because, again, this backs up those earlier references that this is their stand. But see, at this point, this is April, and the treatment was becoming available more widespread. First they started with elderly and those with compromised health, but now it was getting to where the general public, it was more available. And so in Zoom field service, in the congregations, everything was on Zoom. So when they had field service, basically everybody would just be talking to each other and having a cup of coffee, and everybody's talking about the news and they're talking about the big issue, which is this event. And basically at this particular time, everybody was talking about, oh, I got mine, and where did you get it? And oh, you can get it, because everybody wanted to jump the queue, because the narrative in the media was that, there was injustices and who was getting it first, and they wanted to create like a demand. And so they were like telling one another in Zoom field service that they got it and where they could get it, And so everybody was talking it up. And anybody that spoke up, such as I did a few times, but not to influence others, but just to balance it, because it was a green light to talk this way all the time. But just to mention that, oh, did you know that there's a VAERS reporting system, and some people have died, from it, and also that there hasn't been sufficient trials. There's some risks. So just prayerful, just to remind people to prayerfully make a decision and weigh risk versus benefits. But that wasn't allowed. It was like a double standard. So when they came up with this announcement, it sounds balanced, but it's really not. Because let's just go back and look at it again. It says whether someone chooses to be VE'd is a personal decision. One thing that stands out right away is they didn't say whether someone chooses to be VE'd or not is a personal decision. And so really there's this, I didn't fully realize it at the time, but it was, they were really trying to quash any speech against it, which was really what they were disingenuously doing. So that's why it doesn't say or not. Whether someone chooses to be VE'd is a personal decision. So they don't want anybody saying anything that might influence a person not to get it, is really the point. Because that's why they didn't say or not. And thus it would be loving to respect the personal decision that each individual makes based on his Bible-trained conscience, instead of pressuring someone to make the same choice that he made. Now, the reason I'm really, really highlighting this is because this goes back to the Orwellian doublethink and violating their own principles. Because, see, they're stating it again here, what I just read in those earlier references from all those watchtowers, that this is the stand. So when I prove to you that the governing body directly violated this, not only in mandating it for Bethel and special full-time servants, but in update after update, they spiritually beat down anybody as being proud, rebellious, thinking too much of their own opinions. You need to humble yourself and get this thing and show love for one another by getting it. And it's the wise thing to do, and just on and on and on. Very, very heavy propaganda pro getting it. And so it's the opposite of this, showing loving respect for the personal decision that each individual makes. No, it was only one way, only one direction. It was never respecting an individual that didn't want to take it. They were like really looked down on as being unspiritual, not wanting to do what Jehovah wanted you to do, and this was the whole thing. So I really wanted to highlight this because it's all part of this doublethink, this holding these two thoughts at the same time. And I wanted also to highlight this in April 2021 in view of what I'm going to show you that they did by June, and then July, and then August and September of 2021, at the same time that the world was really, really pushing this. The president had given a big speech about how all federal employees, it would be mandated, and that this was United States of America, that people needed to be united. And at the same time, the governing body gave updates about unity, that we needed to all be united. And basically, unity was conformity to get the jab. And that's why I said Orwellian doublespeak. Unity is conformity. Obey and don't use your Christian conscience and just get the thing, and then we'll be united. Don't you dare think too much of your own opinions or your own conscience and not want to get it. It's just mind blowing because they're openly violating the whole history of their Bible understanding and really violating the Bible principles. Now, Galatians 6:5, I mentioned, it says each one must carry his own load, and they've always used this scripture all the time to mean that each Christian has dedicated their life to God, and that nobody else can carry that dedication for them. So in that context, for example, if you were to approach an elder and, oh, Elder Joe, please tell me what to do, the old elder would say, well, this is a personal matter. I can't really tell you what to do in this decision. A person might be like, well, I don't want to think, just tell me. But no, they would spiritually have to direct you to, well, here's some Bible principles. Here's how you can use the Watchtower Index and maybe look up some articles that bring Bible principles to bear on this matter, and then you'll have to make your own decision. So you could get some aid but nobody could take over your personal responsibility. Each one has to carry their own load. So they're always using this in that sense. But as we'll see some more as we go along, they just openly violate it, their own long-standing principle. There's some other things here in the announcement, but this is really what I wanted to focus on, just to keep this down to a specific point or theme in this video. So here's the June 4th announcement, and really this is the first big one as far as the first time they openly and directly endorsed these injections. And they also had started this pattern here. I'll just mention this to the elders. It says meeting part 2021 governing body update number 4. They started substituting meeting parts on the midweek meeting. They would like bump a scheduled part, and they started doing this regularly where, in case anybody missed it and didn't watch it on their own, they wanted everybody to watch these governing body updates during the meeting again, just to make sure nobody missed it. But here's the big thing. Okay, June announcement, June 4, 2021, for all congregations. C19 restrictions. Many governmental public health authorities have stated that fully VE'd people may have greater flexibility in their activities. These activities might include association with others, travel, and assembling for events. It is wise to keep updated on the local government requirements and to respect them. As mentioned in the video 2021 Governing Body Update number 4, Jehovah's Witnesses are not against VE. We view it as a personal decision for each Christian to make, in cooperation with recommendations from public health officials. Many in our Bethel families have already chosen to be, I'll come back over this again, let me finish reading it, chosen to be V. Medical studies have shown that those who are fully V have added protection against the V. A person becomes fully V 2 weeks after receiving all required doses of C19V. Medical studies have also shown that those who choose not to be V should remain more cautious, since they are far more susceptible to the V. All of you are to be warmly commended as you continue to show good judgment and act in a way that demonstrates your respect for life. Now, just going back over this. Wow. Well, first of all, notice there's something going on. It may be in the future videos or something, but there's something going on behind the scenes where they're currying favor with the authorities, bending over backwards to do this. Like, I don't know if they're afraid of losing 501c3 tax exempt or just what it is, but I mean, they're just more than 100% on board with everything that happened here. So they mention it all the time in their videos. Continually, they mention respecting the and doing what the governments want you to do, their requirements. And we'll see in a few minutes how bad that gets. So anyways, here's disingenuous point number 1. They said in that governing body update, because they said, how do Jehovah's Witnesses view this? How do they view the V? And the thing about that was, they speak as if this is just what that is. It's just another, just like a childhood V or whatever. So how do we view that? So it's disingenuous because they never address the fact that these are totally new mRNA, and evidence has come out that they actually alter the DNA. I mean, this is huge. It's a whole new thing. And they even changed the definition of what a V is. The authorities did, the WHO and that. They changed the definition because it's really not a traditional V in any sense. But see, this is, again, instead of being accurate, the governing body is disingenuous because they say, how do Jehovah's Witnesses view V? They don't say, how do Jehovah's Witnesses view this particular experimental therapy, right? They don't say that. It's intentional that they just obscure that. we view it as a personal decision, blah, blah, blah. Um, then again, in cooperation with recommendations from these public health officials. Notice this, many in our Bethel families have already chosen to be vaccinated. Now you have to understand it as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Bethelites are so looked up to. I mean, this is the headquarters. If Bethel is doing it, this is good for me. I mean, that's the last word. And I know from personal experience, even from loved ones, that this was the final thing that pushed them over the edge. When they heard the Bethelites were getting it, then they went and got it. And it breaks my heart to see them have physical things going wrong with them because this is what they bow to. And I'm going to show you that this is outright. I'm going to go so far. This is outright lying, because at this point they hadn't mandated it yet for Bethel, but they say many in our Bethel families have already chosen. So this is June, but by August they had this letter sent out directly from the governing body to all special full-time servants that mandated it. But that they still, in the updates, they kept saying, oh, now we're happy to report that 98% of the Bethel family has gotten the V. So everybody's taking it like, well, they chose to do this and they're being obedient, and that's wonderful. But the thing is, it was mandated. If you didn't get it, you were getting booted out. And I mean, some have been there for decades. They have no savings, you don't earn any Social Security if you're in this volunteer service. And so, like, there's pragmatic things even where couples, if they were to leave after being there for 30 or 40 years because they didn't want to get this treatment, they'd basically be out on their own looking for work, no health care, no medical benefits, and no Social Security even to draw on if they're of that age. So I mean, there's other considerations. People didn't want to, and also people, they want to serve Jehovah, and they really believe this is the thing to do, special full-time service. So they don't want to give that up. So there was very heavy pressure there, and again, it was mandated. So how disingenuous is it to say many have already chosen, and they're clearly using this as a lever? Again, remember, I have to draw this out. They said it would be wrong to pressure others to make the same decision you made. What is this here if not that? To say that Bethel families have already chosen to do this, unless you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you may not fully appreciate the heaviness of this pressure and this peer pressure and what this is saying to do. But this is like on the highest level telling you to go out and get this thing. It's just stunning. And again, the hypocrisy of violating their own standard and their own published information, and even just a few months later from the April announcement that said it would be wrong to pressure people. And then right here they're saying, oh, look, the Bethelites are getting it, so get it. And then they go on to say, medical studies have shown that this is the thing to do. And it says, medical studies have shown that if you don't do it, you're in far more danger. And then, you're all warmly commended, we love you so much. You continue to show good judgment by getting it, and you're showing your respect for life. So it's always this double talk, So like if you're one of these witnesses sitting there and your conscience is telling you, maybe because it's another subject, but there's fetal cell issues with some of these treatments, your conscience doesn't allow you to get it. But see, now you're not using good judgment. You're not demonstrating respect for life. This is what they're saying. It's just so disingenuous. You have to read between the lines with these people. And then this thing about far more susceptible to the virus. It's crazy now because I mean it's so clear. I mean, people were saying it at the time that were awake and listening to other sources other than the mainstream sources. But even they said, the company that made the thing said they never even studied to see if it stops transmission. It wasn't even designed to stop transmission or to keep you from getting it. But that didn't stop them from saying that, Anyways, it's keeping on the theme. It's doublethink and hypocrisy, extreme hypocrisy here. But it gets worse. Okay, here's the big one. Now this is the July 2021 update, and this snippet I'm going to show here is something that they use repeatedly in different letters to special full-time servants, and also in documents that they've made to distribute to the friends, for safety protocols. But they come back to this again and again. See, many even witnesses, or even those critical of the organization, they think like when these individual governing body members get on here, that they have some independence. So they might say, "Oh, Brother Hurd said this," But see, these are all carefully vetted by the entire governing body. In Brother Hurd here, and any of them, they're reading off a teleprompter that was already approved and vetted, and they can't go off script. And that's part of why sometimes they're so stiff and they sound like robots, because some are better at it than others, but reading off a teleprompter is very unnatural. But this is what they're doing. So keep that in mind. This is a specific script, completely vetted. It's not Samuel Hurd's individual thought. This is coming vetted directly from the governing body. It doesn't matter which one is here, because in fact these updates, they were going in a rotation. If you look at the released updates, unless somebody got sick or something, they would go in order through the governing body, and the same order would repeat. So you would get assigned to do, the next one up. And it didn't matter, because, again, you were just reading off the teleprompter. So with all that background, I'm going to show this clip, and then we'll talk about it.
Of course, the decision to be vaccinated is a personal one. What factors might a Christian consider in making the decision? Number one, as Jehovah's Witnesses, we do not have a religious objection to vaccination. Number two, we're in the midst of a pandemic. As of July 9, over 19,000 of our dear brothers and sisters have died from the virus. Number three, in some lands, the superior authorities have made laws requiring all of their citizens to be vaccinated. In other lands, the superior authorities have not made laws, but they are strongly encouraging their citizens to be vaccinated. We each must weigh such factors when making our own personal decision.
It's almost like it's just breathtaking, but this is where I lose like all respect. It's just so disingenuous, this whole thing. But first of all, he gave that meme, how do JWs view V, and they have no objection. And then but let me just backtrack. So I mean, here's the context. He's never saying weigh risk versus benefit, have informed consent, make a decision based on your Bible trained conscience and relating to other matters. It's all about, here's 3 points. Here's really three. Basically, he should have said, if he was being honest and not disingenuous, he should have said, here are 3 reasons to go and get it, and here are 3 reasons why the governing body wants you to go and get it, and to please Jehovah. Here's 3 reasons, because how do Jehovah's Witnesses view V? We don't have no objections to it. And point number 2, again, the fear, and also, really it's a lie. He said 19,000 plus of our dear, it's always our, so your heart goes out, you get emotion of all of our dear brothers and sisters. And mind you, again, that most of these were elderly, and as out in the global population, a lot of them already had pre-existing conditions, cancer, whatever, they're in their 80s. They were likely going to die during 2021 anyways, and 2020. But you never hear that. It's like, oh, the carnage, all this carnage. And notice he said it again. He said and this is the pattern, they said it every time. He said from. He said these 19,000 died directly from the virus, directly, which again, he couldn't say because there's no way to know that. They have no way for that to actually be, it's an alleged, it's surmised, assumed. But again, these were elderly people. Many of them had cancer. Many of them, had multiple things, diabetes, cancer, heart trouble, on and on. And then they passed away in their 80s and 90s. But now they're suddenly, everybody being struck down, So again, that's disingenuous. But really the biggest thing, and the thing that really put me over the edge here was the third point. When he said that governments, plural, around the world had mandated it for all their citizens. Do you know at this point there was only one country on the face of the earth? It was one of these South Sea islands. I forget the name. That's like an independent country. I forget the name of it now. This one country had mandated it for all the citizens, but they don't. Even then, they had only mandated it that you couldn't work if you didn't get it. So in that sense, they had mandated for all the citizens. And then, as he rightly says, many other governments were strongly encouraging it. But and they go into this more later. So he's saying under Romans 13, which is the principle to obey the superior authorities in matters that, for example, you're going to stop at a red light or a stop sign, you obey the government as long as it doesn't conflict with Bible principles. As long as it's not, like Jesus said, get to Caesar what is Caesar's and God's things are God. So if there's a conflict, you follow God. But see, they're implying that because Jehovah's Witnesses view B as okay, that if the government mandates it, well, then you need to follow the government and get it. See, now this outright violates Bible principles, because there are individual Christians and individual Jehovah's Witnesses, and I know many, that their conscience would not permit them to get the treatment. Some it was because of fetal cell issues, and others it was just because of the whole matter of modifying the DNA. There was evidence that these are modifying your God-given DNA. Your DNA that God gave you is being modified by taking this experimental treatment. So I mean, there were biblical issues, as well as not being conformed to the world or believing in men and trusting completely and safe and effective from people who are disingenuous liars, and ultimately, I believe at this point, liars and murderers. But so he's making the point. It says the government is saying to do it. And then he's exaggerating it, because it wasn't, at this point, I know it for a fact, there was only one government that did it at this point, and it was only saying that their citizens that lived on this island nation could not work unless they got it. They didn't like drag the people in and say, physically, like, okay, here, you have to take it. So that was the government mandates. But he's saying, because of this, or even they're strong, where has it ever been if the government's strongly encouraging you to do something that you got to go out and do it? But this is what they're saying. So that put me over the edge, because Romans chapter 13, if you know the history of the organization, for many years under J.F. Rutherford was the one that changed it. He said the superior authorities are Jehovah and Jesus, and that's who we obey. We don't obey the government. But then later, they switched it. I think it was around 1962. The organization switched it to understanding that, because it mentions later in the chapter about paying your taxes and that, so it's clear that it's referring to respecting the government and obeying them as far as you can, showing respect for the authority. But they're taking that because they want all the Jehovah's Witnesses to get this treatment. So they're using that as a lever here, disingenuously and violating what the Bible says, because you have Romans chapter 13, but Romans chapter 14, I encourage you to go read it. It talks about the Christian conscience, and Paul's talking about whether you would eat meat, that had been offered to idols. And some Christians' conscience, they didn't want any part of that meat, but see, it was later sold in the meat market. And so mature Christians, it didn't bother their conscience, they'd buy the meat, but some newer ones maybe had a more sensitive conscience, and they didn't want anything to do with the idols, so they wouldn't eat the meat. But Paul basically said each one should follow their conscience toward God, because if you violate your conscience, you're sinning. And so really, Romans chapter 14 is telling you that the primary thing is to follow your conscience toward God. So if one of Jehovah's Witnesses' conscience is telling them do not get this treatment, no matter how much everybody else is pushing it, no matter how much the government is mandating and saying to get it, maybe you're even going to lose your job unless you get it, a Christian would need to stand for their conscience. So again, these men are ignoring that. They're ignoring they're violating their own published information and the Bible about that they're a Bible teaching organization. They don't get involved in health treatment, other than the blood issue, but that's another subject. But so they're violating that, because what's he doing? He's sitting here telling you to get it, and so they're violating that. So it's this doublethink, this hypocrisy, this Orwellian thing where they have the authority somehow to violate Bible principles, and anybody that in the organization or any elders that would speak up, well, they're being marginalized over this. and being looked at as unspiritual. But again, it's this Orwellian double think. You're holding two thoughts in your mind at the same time. Because he even says it here. He says he's careful to say, oh, each Christian's personal choice. But really, if you're going to be a loyal Jehovah's Witness and the governing body is pressuring you and pushing you to get this thing, well, then what choice would you really have? Your choice is to follow Jehovah and be loyal and faithful. And that's what the majority of the 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses did. And I know personally people that died after they got this treatment. And the only reason they had gotten it was because of organizational pressure and peer pressure. So that's blood guilt. There's blood. This man sitting here looking at you with his hands, there's blood on those hands. I'm sorry. Okay, just to wrap it up, there's so much more to be said, and perhaps that could be in other videos, more detail. But I'm going to end off where I started. And there's things coming up that could go in more depth. As I said, and this is important. This was this herd update that July of 2021 was quickly followed by even worse updates, just incredible. In the next month, and really for about 6 straight months, the updates were very blatantly, openly pushing this treatment, and again, openly violating their own standard and getting away with it, and people just not getting it. And so July 2021 was the month that all special full-time servants were mandated to get it, and the far majority of Jehovah's Witnesses don't know this, and even the far majority of the elders don't even know this. But I've seen the actual letter, physical photograph copy of the letter, and it's clearly what happened. And then again in September, there was the purge, where they directly went after any elders that weren't towing the line. But before this, I had resigned in June when that first announcement came out. I had resigned as an elder over that. I could not be party to any of the blood guilt, not share in the sins of others, is the principle. So just to wrap it all around where we started, this Orwellian, I think just the bit I've touched on here shows the direct hypocrisy and the direct doublethink that's going on here. Because if you were to ask most Jehovah's Witnesses, what's the organizational stand? How does the governing body view most would say, oh, it's a personal choice, because they keep hearing that. But at the same time, they know the thing to do is to get it, and that's what they want you to do. And I've even heard in meetings recently, pretty much the ones coming right out and saying that we needed to be obedient and go ahead, and even if we really didn't want to, we needed to submit and go ahead and get the thing. So just to reiterate then, this Orwellian thought, that choice is unity, choice is conformity, and really the governing body, the organization represented by the governing body, is really like the party, and they're really experts at indoctrination and providing doublethink. Remember, the definition was, it's the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts in one's head. They are the result of indoctrination. They are only present because an overwhelming force convinced the thinker that both are true. And see, the overwhelming force in this case was really the double punch of the global mainstream narrative, like, for example, we'll just say like CNN, the narrative that was put out there, and then now being one of Jehovah's Witnesses, now you've got the narrative also coming, the same narrative coming from your spiritual leaders that you look up to and have the utmost respect for, that to you are the very voice of Jehovah God. Food at the proper time, keeping us safe. We're so grateful that Jehovah is keeping us safe in the land of the living. So now you've got this doublethink from this heavy indoctrination. As Orwell said, to know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment it was needed, and then promptly forget it again. So, just to end with that thought, as Orwell wrote, he said, "History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right." Nothing exists except this endless present where the organization, where the governing body is always right.